Evelyn Sanders had always found a kind of gentle magic in the local park. Even as she pushed past her 68th birthday, her steps a little slower and her joints prone to stiffening when the temperature dipped, her favorite bench beneath the sprawling oak tree never lost its charm. The place was a microcosm of life's simpler joys. A stone walkway circling the pond, a modest but well-kept flower bed, and the playful chorus of children giggling near the swings. She came here once a week, sometimes more if she could manage it, to feed the ducks and let the sun warm her face. It was a Monday in early June, and the afternoon light draped across Lakewood Park in shimmering gold. Evelyn had timed her walk perfectly, arriving just after lunch so she could beat the school rush. She was partial to these quieter hours. Mothers with strollers, retirees on midday strolls, and the occasional jogger. She wore a lilac cardigan over a simple blouse, her favorite pair of sturdy flats, and a wide-brimmed straw hat to shade her eyes. Beneath the brim, her short, silver curls framed warm brown cheeks marked by a lifetime of smiles and sorrows. As she settled onto the bench, setting her cane beside her, she noticed a cluster of children squealing in delight around a bright red slide. The smallest among them couldn't have been older than 3, and his delighted squeak tugged at Evelyn's heart. She remembered her son Dylan at that age, curious, fearless, forever with a scrunched nose whenever he concentrated on a toy or puzzle. Dylan was a federal agent now, devoted to his work. Though he rarely admitted it openly, Evelyn suspected he chose his career path to honor his late father, Richard, who had been a local police officer. Richard had passed away far too early, leaving Evelyn and Dylan to navigate life's challenges on their own. They had done well, forging a special bond that had grown stronger with every test life threw at them. There was a certain familiarity to the breeze that swept across the water in Lakewood Park, as if time itself whispered stories of the past. Evelyn breathed it in, letting a faint smile cross her lips. She thought of the many days she'd sat on this exact bench reading books, sometimes laughing with a neighbor, sometimes merely gazing into the shimmering pond. Today, she carried neither a book nor a phone, just a small bag of crumbs for the ducks. She leaned forward, sprinkling a handful on the grass near the pond's edge. A few mallards scuttled closer, quacking indignantly as they fought for the tiny morsels. Evelyn chuckled at the sight, recalling how Dylan used to get so excited whenever ducks came right up to him. He would squeal, "Mommy, they're not scared of me." As if summoned by thought alone, Evelyn's phone buzzed from inside her purse. She fished it out and saw Dylan's name flash on the screen. "Hey, sweetheart," she said as she brought the phone to her ear. "Hey, Ma. Just checking in. How are you feeling today?" Evelyn's heart always warmed at the sound of his voice. "I'm good, honey. At the park, as usual on a Monday. You know me." She heard the faintest sigh on his end. "Wish I could be there with you. I'm stuck in a briefing right now, but I'll try to swing by the house later. Maybe we can do dinner if I get off at a decent time." "That would be lovely," she said softly, picturing his broad shoulders and that determined look he wore whenever work consumed him. "Don't overwork yourself, Dylan. Your father always used to say, justice doesn't rest, but we have to, or we become no good to anyone." He let out a small laugh. "Yeah, Dad was right. I'll keep that in mind. All right, Ma, I've got to go. I love you. I love you too. Stay safe." The call ended, leaving Evelyn with the echo of Dylan's voice drifting through her thoughts. She was proud of the man he had become, compassionate, brave, and steadfast. Richard would have been proud too. Evelyn placed her phone back in her purse, returning her attention to the peaceful scene before her. The mallards had finished the crumbs, waddling around in search of more. A light breeze played with the leaves overhead, creating a soothing rustle. A pair of squirrels chased each other up the trunk of the oak tree, tiny claws scraping bark as they scurried higher. The serenity was broken by the unexpected crunch of boots on gravel. Evelyn glanced to her left and spotted 2 men ambling down the winding path. She wasn't sure why they caught her attention initially. Maybe it was the way they moved, a certain tension in their stride, or the fact that they paused in unison to survey the park. They looked to be in their mid-30s. One was tall and broad-shouldered with a shaved head. He wore worn-out jeans, heavy black boots, and a scuffed leather jacket that seemed too warm for the day's mild temperature. The other man was slightly shorter, with a wiry frame and close-cropped dark hair, his eyes scanning the park with hawk-like focus. Something about him made Evelyn uneasy. She noticed he kept clenching and unclenching his fists as though expecting a fight at any moment. She tried not to stare, but as she turned her gaze back to the ducks, a chill settled in the pit of her stomach. The men's conversation was too distant to understand, yet she could sense them drifting closer, step by step, their voices low and tense. A subtle current of antagonism seemed to hang around them like a cloud. Evelyn inhaled slowly. Perhaps they were just passers-by. She decided not to give it more thought. It wasn't her nature to assume the worst. She was old enough to have encountered all kinds of people, and although a lifetime of experiences taught her caution, she also believed in not judging a book by its cover. Yet as she sprinkled the last bit of crumbs onto the ground, footsteps drew near. She set the paper bag aside, forcing a small smile that she hoped projected friendliness. Anything to diffuse the tension she felt creeping up her spine. "Afternoon," said the wiry one, his tone just a shade too casual. He stepped into Evelyn's peripheral vision, stopping only a foot or two away from her bench. The tall man loomed behind him, a silent figure, arms crossed over his chest. "Afternoon," Evelyn replied, keeping her voice polite. Her gaze flicked briefly to the tall one, but he offered no greeting. "Nice day," the wiry man continued. "You come here often?" Evelyn offered a simple nod, measuring her words. "I do. It's a lovely spot. The ducks are always friendly when I bring crumbs." He smirked, exchanging a glance with the tall man behind him. "I see." He cast an eye at her cane, then at her cardigan and straw hat. "You live around here long?" "Yes," she said, trying to keep her tone even. "Many years, in fact. It's a quiet neighborhood." The tall man let out a short laugh, though it held no humor. "Not always, though. Sometimes things happen, even in quiet neighborhoods." Evelyn felt a prickle of apprehension. She could sense an undercurrent of hostility she couldn't quite place. "I suppose that's true of anywhere." "Yeah." The wiry man rocked on his heels. "It sure is." For a moment, the three stood in awkward silence. She considered making an excuse, perhaps feigning that she needed to leave, but her pride wouldn't let her just run off. This was her park too, after all. A mother with a stroller passed by on the far edge of the path, tossing a curious glance at the scene. Evelyn couldn't help but notice the mother quicken her pace, as though sensing something was off. The men hardly acknowledged her. Their attention seemed fixed on Evelyn. The wiry man took a small step forward. "You live alone?" he asked, the question abrupt. "No husband or anything?" Evelyn's stomach lurched, but she kept her composure. "My husband passed away," she answered softly. "I have a son." The tall man's lips twitched into something resembling a grin, though it was full of malice. "Sorry to hear that," he said, voice dripping with insincerity. "Didn't mean to pry," the wiry man added, though the look in his eyes suggested otherwise. "Just, some folks around here act like they own the place. We like to keep things neighborly, you know?" Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. She'd heard dog whistle remarks like that before. In her younger days, she might have bristled at the implication that she didn't belong in her own neighborhood, but the years taught her how to keep an outward calm. "I appreciate neighborly gestures," she said with a tight smile, "but I don't believe kindness should come with conditions." The wiry man gave a short chuckle, turning to the tall one. "Hear that, Russ? She wants us to be kind." Russ, the tall one, glowered at Evelyn. "We can be kind," he said slowly, "when folks know their place." Before Evelyn could respond, he took a menacing step closer, overshadowing her space. His voice dropped. "And from what I see, some folks don't know it." She tried to keep her voice steady. "Excuse me?" In an instant, the polite pretense was gone. The wiry man leaned in, his voice low. "You heard him. We don't like strangers acting like they run things around here." Evelyn's heart pounded. She wanted to stand up and leave, but fear of stumbling or appearing weak kept her rooted. She swallowed, forcing as much steel as possible into her tone. "I'm no stranger. I've lived here for decades." "Really?" the wiry man responded, looking her up and down. "Could have fooled me." Russ moved to her other side. effectively boxing her in on the bench. He pointed at the cane. What's that for? You got a bad leg? Evelyn gripped the handle of her cane. It's none of your business. The wiry man's eyes narrowed. Hey, take it easy. We're just chatting. Why so tense, ma'am? He said the word ma'am with a venomous sneer that contradicted any notion of respect. Evelyn decided to stand. If she could just put some distance between herself and these men, maybe head to the park entrance, she could find safety. She gathered her purse and cane, steeling herself to walk away. But as she tried to rise, the wiry man reached out and pressed a hand on her shoulder, forcing her back onto the bench. Where are you going? We're still talking. Fear seized her. The physical contact was jolting, and the casual way he pinned her back down made her realize he felt no concern about being seen. Like he assumed no one would intervene. Maybe he had reason to think that. Evelyn cast a quick glance around the park. The mother with the stroller had disappeared, and the playground area was empty now. If anyone else was around, they weren't close enough to help. Russ stepped in front, arms folded, looming like a sentinel. Better listen to my friend here. Evelyn swallowed the knot in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to shout or fight back. But she knew how quickly these encounters could turn violent, especially with men who projected this much malice. She forced her tone calm, though her heart thundered. Let me go, please. The wiry man's grip relaxed, and he removed his hand as if granting her a favor. But he hovered close, lips curled in a sneer. If you behave. What do you want? She asked, voice trembling slightly. Russ spoke up, jerking his chin at her purse. We want you to know your place. Maybe lighten that purse a little to show your goodwill. Evelyn pressed the purse tight against her side. I'm not giving you money, and I have nothing of great value anyway. The wiry man's eyes flicked to the modest gold watch on her wrist. Looks like you're doing all right for yourself, lady. She raised her chin, forcing courage. I've worked hard my whole life. That's not a crime. Russ let out a low laugh. No, but maybe being in the wrong place is. The spark of defiance. Something in Evelyn snapped. Maybe it was the memory of her husband's unwavering sense of duty, or the knowledge that Dylan was only a phone call away. She glared at the men with a fierceness she didn't know she still possessed. I'm not going anywhere. This is my neighborhood too. Her words seemed to amuse the wiry man. Bold. I can respect that. Then he glanced at Russ. But you know, boldness can be a problem when it's not wanted. Russ reached for her cane, trying to yank it from her grasp. She held on, but he was stronger, twisting it from her hand. He inspected it mockingly, tapping the tip on the ground. I don't think you'll be needing this. Fear iced her veins as she found herself unarmed. Even though the cane was mostly for support, it was still a comfort. Losing it felt symbolic, a sign they could strip her of whatever safety she had. Evelyn's mind raced. She needed an escape, or at least a lifeline. Maybe if she could distract them, she could yell for help or reach for her phone. Could she even outrun them? Unlikely. Her knee ached on good days, let alone when she had to sprint away from two men half her age. Before she could speak, the wiry man's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, glancing at the screen, then nodded at Russ. We should wrap this up. Let's see what Grandma's got in the purse. Then we move. Russ sneered. Don't worry, we'll leave you be in a minute. He tugged at the purse strap. Evelyn tightened her grip. No, stop. Anger flashed in the wiry man's eyes. He grabbed at her arms, trying to pry the purse free. Evelyn gasped, her voice rising in a plea she wasn't sure anyone would hear. Help. Russ cursed under his breath. Shut up. He clamped a hand over her mouth, muffling her cries. Panic tore through Evelyn as she struggled, heart hammering so loud she could hardly think. Then, as if in answer to her silent prayer, she heard a voice call out from across the park. Get your hands off her. Her vision blurred with tears, but she knew that voice anywhere. Dylan. Relief coursed through her veins as her son sprinted toward them, his stride swift and decisive. He wore a navy windbreaker over slacks, and the glint of his badge at his waist was unmistakable. What the? The wiry man spat, releasing Evelyn's arms. Russ drew back, still holding her cane. Dylan stopped a few paces away, chest heaving, eyes blazing with a fury Evelyn rarely saw. His gaze flicked from Evelyn's disheveled state to the men looming over her. I said, get away from her. Now. Russ brandished the cane like a club. Back off, man. Dylan's voice hardened to a tone Evelyn recognized from the stories he told about field operations. I'm a federal agent. Drop the cane and step away. The wiry man froze for a split second before letting out a derisive laugh. Federal agent? You can't be serious. Dylan reached inside his jacket, producing his badge. I'm very serious. Assaulting a senior citizen isn't a great move, especially in front of law enforcement. For a moment, it seemed Russ might comply, but the wiry man jerked his head, and Russ tightened his grip on the cane instead. Evelyn felt her stomach lurch. She wanted to shout for Dylan to be careful, but fear clamped her throat. She'd seen enough news stories to know how quickly violence could escalate. Dylan glanced at his surroundings, noticing the emptiness of the park. Evelyn saw his jaw tighten. He extended a hand toward the men, palm out in a calming gesture. Look, I don't want this to get worse. Let her go, drop the cane, and we'll talk this through. Russ shifted uncomfortably. He looked to the wiry man for guidance, but the wiry man's eyes blazed with defiance. We're not dropping anything. This old lady tried to assault us. We were just defending ourselves. Evelyn's eyes widened at the blatant lie. She thought she saw Dylan's lip curl in disdain. You and I both know that's not what happened. Russ barked. Doesn't matter what you think. You got no proof. A flash of determination crossed Dylan's face as he squared his shoulders. I'm the proof. Now step away. Suddenly, the wiry man lunged at Dylan, swinging a wild punch. Dylan dodged swiftly, stepping aside and deflecting the blow with his forearm. The wiry man stumbled momentarily, then snarled and charged again. Evelyn tried to scramble to her feet, eyes glued to the scuffle. Her heart clamored in her chest. She wanted to help but knew she'd only get in the way. Russ backed up, as though unsure whether to join the fight or flee. The wiry man kept throwing punches at Dylan, who sidestepped with practiced skill. In one fluid motion, Dylan caught the man's wrist, twisted him around, and forced him down. The wiry man let out a yelp of pain as his arm was pinned behind his back. Evelyn heard Dylan's calm but commanding voice, "Stay down." Russ let out a string of curses, dropping the cane to free his hands. For a moment, it looked like he would tackle Dylan from behind. Then the wiry man shouted, "Russ, let's go." Without further warning, Russ turned on his heels and sprinted down the path. The wiry man struggled against Dylan's hold, flailing to break free. Sensing his partner had fled, he twisted awkwardly, wriggled free with surprising dexterity, and dashed off in the opposite direction. Dylan cursed under his breath, torn between pursuing them or tending to his mother. He chose Evelyn, rushing to her side. "Ma, are you hurt?" She shook her head, though tears brimmed in her eyes. I'm fine, just shaken." Dylan crouched next to her, carefully taking her hand. His expression was awash in concern. "Let me see." He inspected her wrists where the men had grabbed her. Slight bruises were already forming. His jaw set in anger. "I'm sorry I didn't get here sooner." Evelyn pulled him into a trembling embrace. "You got here right when I needed you." A few bystanders finally approached, phones out, recording or calling emergency services. Dylan signaled to one to phone the local police, though he was fairly certain calls had already been made. Evelyn leaned against the bench, still catching her breath. "They were so brazen," she murmured. "They didn't seem afraid of anyone." Dylan frowned, scanning the park as if expecting them to reappear. "I recognized the look in their eyes. This isn't just casual trouble. That was hate. They targeted you because they think you don't belong here." Evelyn's voice trembled with a mixture of fear and anger. "I've lived in this community for over 40 years. People like them can't just decide where I belong." Dylan exhaled slowly, trying to steady his emotions. "And we won't let them. Mom, I promise you, they won't get away with this." She nodded, forcing a determined smile through the tears. "I believe you." Sirens wailed in the distance. 2 patrol cars pulled up near the park entrance, their lights painting the air with flashing reds and blues. Officers climbed out, scanning the area for any sign of the perpetrators. Dylan guided them to where Evelyn sat, explaining the situation with calm precision. One of the officers, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached carefully. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Evelyn mustered a reassuring nod. "They got away, but I'll be all right." Dylan introduced himself formally, showing his badge. "Agent Dylan Sanders, Federal. These men tried to rob and assault my mother. They fled on foot in opposite directions." The officer took notes, describing the men's appearance over her radio. "We'll have units search the perimeter. We can take your statement at the station or here, whichever you prefer." Evelyn looked at Dylan, a silent question in her eyes. He spoke up. "We'll give statements here first, then I'll take her to the hospital for a checkup. She was manhandled, and she's got some bruises." Evelyn wanted to protest. She didn't relish a hospital visit, but the ache in her arms and the strain in her knee convinced her otherwise. The next hour passed in a flurry of questions and statements. Evelyn recounted the confrontation while Dylan added his perspective on the scuffle. Bystanders who had gathered gave their own accounts, though most arrived late in the altercation. Still, they confirmed seeing two men harassing Evelyn and fleeing when Dylan intervened. With each retelling, Evelyn felt the shock slowly morph into resolve. She would not allow these men, Caleb Dunbar and Russ Hargrove, or whatever their names turned out to make her feel unsafe in her own home, in her own park. An EMT arrived to check her vitals, helping her into an ambulance seat to examine her bruises. Dylan stayed by her side, a steadying hand on her shoulder. Through the open ambulance door, she saw the sky beginning to transition to the soft hues of dusk. Evelyn turned to Dylan as the EMT wrapped a small bandage around a scrape on her forearm. "This was no random robbery, was it?" she asked softly. "They singled me out for a reason." Dylan's gaze was hard. "It sure felt that way. They used words that pointed to hate, not just greed. People like that, they think intimidation keeps everyone silent. They picked the wrong family this time." She let out a shaky breath. "Promise me they won't come back." He wanted to give her that promise, but Dylan was a realist. "I'll do everything I can to protect you, but I also need your help. If the police and I build a case, we can push the district attorney to charge them properly, especially if this is a hate crime." Evelyn nodded, steeling herself. "Of course, whatever it takes." That night, after a brief hospital checkup and a clean bill of health aside for minor bruises, Evelyn returned home with Dylan's arm gently supporting her. She sank into her favorite armchair, still wearing the same clothes she'd worn to the park. As she looked around her cozy living room, photographs of Dylan's graduation, her wedding portrait with Richard, little knickknacks from decades of memories, she realized how much this sense of home mattered to her. Dylan knelt beside her, a hand resting gently on hers. "You rest, Ma. I'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow, I'll coordinate with the local prosecutor's office. We'll find these guys." She closed her eyes, letting a tear slip down her cheek. "I'm not going to let them take away my peace." "You won't have to," Dylan said. "They'll answer for what they've done." A firm silence settled between them, the kind that conveys certainty without needing further words. Evelyn felt a surge of gratitude for her son's unwavering support, for her own courage in standing her ground, and for the possibility that justice could indeed prevail. In a world that so often felt unpredictable, she found comfort in the knowledge that, despite everything, there were still good people willing to stand up for what was right. As she drifted to sleep, Evelyn reminded herself, hate can never be stronger than love, not when we refuse to bow to it. Little did she know that this skirmish in the park was only the beginning of something far greater, an unraveling thread that would expose darker secrets and test her community's resolve. But for now, in this moment, she was safe. And with Dylan watching over her, she felt a glimmer of hope that justice was not just a vague concept, but a tangible promise waiting to be fulfilled. Dylan Sanders woke up the next morning with a dull ache behind his eyes and the weight of the previous day pressing on his chest. He had spent the night on the couch in his mother's living room, blankets bunched up at his feet and the early sunlight now streaming through the curtains. With a slow exhale, he pushed aside the covers and glanced around, reassured by the familiar sight of framed family photos on the walls and the gentle tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. He caught the faint aroma of coffee drifting in from the kitchen, which meant Evelyn was already awake. He stretched the stiffness out of his neck, remembering how late they had stayed up giving statements to the local police. The official on-duty detective had been sympathetic enough, but Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn's assault might get lumped in with other, random incidents, unless he personally saw it through. He was determined not to let that happen. He found Evelyn at the kitchen table, a ceramic mug of coffee in front of her and the morning paper folded neatly by her elbow. She still wore her light cardigan from yesterday, buttoned carefully up the front, and Dylan noticed the faint bruises around her wrists. She was holding the mug with both hands, gaze distant, as though lost in thoughts she wasn't quite ready to share. When he cleared his throat, she blinked and offered him a soft, reassuring smile. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, voice gentle. "I figured you could use some coffee. I made eggs if you're hungry." He rubbed his eyes. "Thanks, Ma. You beat me to it. How are you feeling?" She tapped a finger against one of the bruises on her arm. "A bit sore, but I've had worse. Don't worry about me. I'm more concerned about what we do next." He nodded, pulled up a chair across from her, and sighed. "I was thinking the same thing. After we gave our statements, I made sure the local precinct filed this under a potential hate crime assault, but that's just the start. We need to find those two men before they vanish. The police have a minimal lead on them since they ran in different directions, but I also want to get in touch with the county prosecutor, see if we can open a bigger investigation." Evelyn cradled her mug. "Do you really think it'll go that far? They seemed hateful, no doubt, but I don't know. Maybe they were just a couple of thugs looking to score some money?" Dylan shook his head, remembering the sneer in the wiry man's eyes, the way he called Evelyn grandma in such a venomous tone. Russ's talk about people knowing their place. It wasn't random. I could feel it. And once they realized I was law enforcement, they didn't even try to spin it as a misunderstanding. They ran. I think they've done this kind of thing before. Evelyn studied the coffee in her mug. "Do you think they'll come after me again?" He slid a comforting hand across the table, resting it on hers. "I'm not going to let that happen, but you should be careful. Keep your phone on you at all times, and if you see anybody suspicious, call me right away. If they truly are repeat offenders, we can bet they won't quit on their own." She pressed her lips together in a thin line. "I won't hide, Dylan. This is my home, my neighborhood. I'm not about to barricade myself indoors because of a couple of hateful men." He squeezed her hand softly. "I understand. Nobody's asking you to hide. But promise me you'll take precautions. It's different now that we know what they're capable of." A moment of silence passed, heavy but not hopeless. Outside, a lawnmower buzzed in a neighboring yard, a mundane reminder that life was going on around them. Evelyn gave him a brisk nod, as though settling an internal debate. "Then we'll face it head-on," she said. "Tell me what you need me to do." He ran a palm over his short-cropped hair. "First, I'll talk to the county prosecutor I've worked with in the past, Malik Ortiz. He's a specialist in bias-related crimes. If we can get the local police to loop him in, we'll have more leverage to investigate. We can't build a federal case just yet, but we can explore that angle depending on what we find. Next, I might need you to give more details about the incident, especially if there's any press or if other victims come forward. Hearing it from you could embolden others." Evelyn straightened in her seat, shoulders firm. "I'll do whatever it takes." He nodded. "All right, then that's our plan." He glanced at the clock. "I'd better get going. If I hurry, I can catch Malik before his morning docket starts." She handed him a small thermos of coffee and insisted he take some scrambled eggs in a to-go container. He tried to refuse, but his mother's stern gaze told him he'd lose that argument. As he stuffed the container into his work bag, Evelyn walked him to the front door, pausing on the threshold. She placed a hand on his arm. "Dylan, be careful. I'm not the only one they threatened yesterday." He forced a reassuring grin. "They can try anything they want. I've got enough training to handle it." After an exchange of goodbyes, Dylan made his way out to the driveway, unlocked his sedan, and slid behind the wheel. Once he started the engine, he took a second to breathe. He felt an undercurrent of anger in the pit of his stomach. Anger at how blatant those men had been. Anger at the fear they'd instilled in his mother. He promised himself he wouldn't let it fester into something uncontrolled. Instead, he'd channel it into methodical, thorough investigation. With that resolve firmly in mind, he drove toward the downtown government center where the county's prosecutors had their offices. The ride took him past the leafy streets of Evelyn's neighborhood, rolling into busier avenues dotted with coffee shops, small businesses, and chain pharmacies. Eventually, the courthouse came into view, a stately white-columned building that seemed to glow in the morning sun. Dylan parked and headed inside, flashing his ID at the security checkpoint and riding the elevator to the third floor where Malik's office was located. He found Malik Ortiz reviewing a stack of files at a long table outside a courtroom, thick black hair combed precisely, dark eyes scanning through typed reports. Malik wore a crisp navy suit, and he looked up at Dylan's approach with a flicker of surprise. "Agent Sanders," he said, setting down the paperwork. "Haven't seen you in a couple of weeks. What's going on?" Dylan quickly explained the incident, describing the details of how Evelyn had been harassed and nearly robbed in the park. He emphasized the hateful words, the slurs, and the sense of targeted intimidation. Malik's expression darkened as he listened. "Damn," he muttered when Dylan finished. "I'm sorry your mother had to go through that. This is exactly the kind of case I want to push harder, but I need more than just your testimony. I'll need local buy-in too." Dylan shifted his weight. "The local police took statements, but they're shorthanded. I think your involvement would make a difference. If these men have been harassing other people, especially targeting minorities, we could have a pattern of hate crimes on our hands." Malik gave a thoughtful nod. "I'll call the station chief and see if we can arrange a joint task force. My office has been trying to clamp down on racially motivated vandalism and intimidation in the region. Maybe this can be the catalyst. If you can get me more leads or any eyewitness accounts, that would help." Dylan felt a rush of gratitude. "I'll start digging. I'll see if we can get a better description. Maybe track down some CCTV footage around the park. I've also got a few colleagues who might help run facial recognition if we can get them on camera." A bailiff stepped out of the nearby courtroom, calling Malik's name. The prosecutor gave Dylan an apologetic look. "I have to go inside for a hearing, but keep me posted. This is something I don't want to slip through the cracks." Dylan thanked him and stepped away, glancing down at his phone to see a text from Evelyn, just a simple heart emoji that made him smile. He texted her back a quick thumbs up, then headed for the elevator, determined to get started. As he left the building, he decided to swing by the police station next. He'd originally planned to wait a day, but speed was crucial. The sooner he got hold of any park security footage or traffic cams, the better. At the station, he was met by a junior officer who escorted him to a cramped back office. Piled cardboard boxes labeled with case numbers lined the walls. A detective named Ranger, a tall woman with curly hair pulled into a high ponytail, stood behind a desk, arms crossed. She looked up from a scattering of files with a curious tilt of her head. "Agent Sanders? I'm Detective Connie Ranger. I heard about the incident involving your mother. Terrible stuff." Dylan shook her hand. "Thanks for seeing me. I'm hoping we can coordinate. My mom filed a statement last night, and I'm looking for any additional angles. Maybe we can track down the suspects." Ranger gestured for him to sit. "I've already got an APB on them based on the description your mother gave, but it's pretty generic. One tall, bald man, one wiry with short dark hair. Clothes could be different by now. No license plate details, no address, no known alias." "That's why I'm here," Dylan said. "I'll contact the city's traffic department to pull any footage from cameras near Lakewood Park. Maybe we can catch them entering or leaving. Also, if there's a CCTV near the convenience store on the main road, we can see if they walked by." Ranger tapped a pen against her desk. "I've also seen a handful of old complaints that might fit the same pattern. We had a grocery store clerk who reported 2 men harassing customers a month ago, calling them slurs, claiming they didn't belong in this town. Same rough description, but they disappeared before officers arrived. No arrests made. Since then, no follow-up. Could be the same guys." Dylan's jaw clenched. "If they've been operating unchecked this long, they'll keep doing it unless we stop them. I talked to the county prosecutor, Malik Ortiz. He's willing to get involved if there's enough evidence of a hate crime pattern." Ranger nodded, scribbling notes. "I'm open to sharing data. We don't get many resources for these cases unless they turn violent, which is unfortunate. But I'll see what I can dig up in our system. They spent the next hour reviewing old case logs, scanning descriptions of suspects who matched the men's profiles. A surprising pattern emerged: multiple minor incidents of vandalism or harassment across the local counties. In many of them, the victims had been people of color, elderly residents, or immigrants. Most victims didn't pursue charges, either because they were too afraid or they believed nothing would come of it. Dylan's frustration grew as he read the brief notes about one family's fence being spray-painted with hateful language, or a local bodega owner complaining about a pair of men who lingered outside, yelling slurs at customers. After combing through what felt like a mountain of partial leads, Ranger sighed. It's sad how much goes unreported. If your mother's assault can shine a light on this pattern, then maybe we can finally put a stop to it. Dylan stood. I appreciate your help. I'll coordinate with Malik, and if you get any break or if someone calls in a tip, let me know right away. I'll do the same. They exchanged contact information, parted ways, and Dylan returned to his sedan, parked beside a line of squad cars. He sat for a moment, breathing in the stale air of the vehicle. He pictured Evelyn, sitting at home, bravely insisting she wouldn't hide. He admired her resolve. She was a stronger woman than most, but he hated that she had to face this at all. With a shake of his head, he pulled his seatbelt across his chest and drove toward the traffic department on the other side of town. A wave of tedious bureaucracy awaited him. Forms, signatures, verification of his credentials. He spent part of the afternoon with a tired city employee who scrolled through hours of camera footage at double speed, trying to catch glimpses of the two men or any suspicious group that might match their descriptions. He found one short clip of two men walking briskly along the main road adjacent to the park a half hour after the assault. The footage was grainy, the faces partly obscured by shadows, but their builds matched. Dylan asked for a copy, feeling a small surge of hope. It wasn't enough for a solid ID, but it proved they had headed south. Maybe, if he cross-referenced timestamps with other cameras, he could piece together a route. It was a start. By late afternoon, he swung by a sandwich shop to grab a late lunch. He took his phone out while waiting in line, updating Malik with a quick text about the partial camera footage and the pattern of prior complaints. Malik replied that he would start building a framework for potential charges, and that if Dylan uncovered more direct proof, like a witness who could link the men to an explicit hate-based intent, they'd have a strong foundation in court. Dylan's mind wandered to other possibilities. Maybe the men posted online. Maybe they had a network. People like that often bragged about their exploits in certain corners of social media. If he got a warrant, he could dig deeper. Heading home after a busy day, Dylan felt the tension in his shoulders. He parked in front of Evelyn's house just as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the sky streaked with orange and pink. A flicker of relief passed through him when he saw her silhouette in the living room window. At least she was safe inside. He let himself in with his key, found her in the kitchen again, this time chopping vegetables for a hearty stew. She wore a colorful apron, her expression serene, like she decided to embrace normalcy despite the previous day's chaos. She offered him a smile. You look tired. Busy day? He set his bag on a chair. You have no idea. He explained everything he'd done. The talk with Malik, scanning camera footage, going through old complaints. Evelyn listened quietly, her chopping slow and steady, absorbing each piece of information. By the time he finished, she set down the knife and wiped her hands on the apron. Thank you, she said, voice thick with gratitude. For all of this. For taking it seriously. He placed a hand on her shoulder. I'll never forgive myself if I don't. These men have been terrorizing people for who knows how long. It's time we put a stop to it. She took a step closer, worry knitting her brow. I just hope they don't come looking for trouble again. What if they really are part of some larger group, like some kind of extremist organization? That's how these things often go, isn't it? Dylan sighed, remembering the hateful graffiti in those old case files. It's possible, but let's not jump to conclusions. Even if they have a few friends, once law enforcement gets on their tail, they'll find it harder to operate in the open. That's why we have to keep pushing. Fear relies on silence. She nodded and pressed her lips together, thoughtful. True. I won't be silent. They shared dinner at the small kitchen table, the aroma of stew comforting them both. While they ate, Evelyn recounted mundane details of her day. She had folded laundry, watched an old black and white movie, tried to distract herself from the memory of that wiry man's sneer. The normalcy was a soothing balm. Yet Dylan caught the hint of tremor in her voice when she lingered on the events in the park. She was brave, but he could see the hidden worry in her eyes. After dinner, while he helped her wash dishes, his phone buzzed. He dried his hands and checked the screen. It was Ranger, the detective from the station. The text read, "Got a partial ID from prior complaint. Looks like the taller suspect might be Russell Hargrove, known to hang with a man named Caleb Dunbar. They have minor arrest records, mostly petty assault or harassment charges. I'll send more details soon." Dylan felt a rush of adrenaline as he read the message. So they finally had names, Russell Hargrove and Caleb Dunbar. He showed it to Evelyn, who drew in a slow breath. "So that wiry one is likely Caleb, and the tall one is Russ?" she asked. "Sounds like it," Dylan said. "I'll call Ranger back, see if they have addresses, known associates, anything." This is progress. They migrated to the living room, where Evelyn settled onto the couch and Dylan made the call. Ranger picked up on the first ring, explaining that Russ was indeed tied to a couple of minor hate incidents. Caleb, on the other hand, seemed to be the more cunning one, though he'd never served serious time. Ranger promised to forward the files first thing in the morning. Dylan thanked her, and his heart drummed with renewed determination. Now that they had names, maybe they could find out where Caleb and Russ lived. Maybe they could even get a warrant if the evidence stacked up right. When he hung up, Evelyn looked at him with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Those men, if they know we're onto them, they might go to ground or skip town. Dylan took a seat beside her. "That's exactly why we move fast. I'll coordinate with Malik and the local detectives, see if we can pick them up. If we can locate them, we might arrest them for assault, attempted robbery, possibly a hate crime enhancement. Once we have them in custody, we can dig into their connections." She nodded, her gaze drifting to the window, where the night sky pressed against the glass. A silence passed, not entirely comfortable. Dylan sensed her mind was replaying yesterday's incident, the panic she must have felt, pinned to the bench by a man's hateful grip. He placed a hand on her shoulder again, gently. "They won't hurt you," he murmured. "Not on my watch." She gave him a grateful smile. "I know, Dylan. I believe in you." He felt a sudden surge of emotion, pride, and protectiveness tangled together. He had chosen this line of work in part because of the values Evelyn and his late father had instilled in him: integrity, courage, the pursuit of justice. Now, those principles were being tested in the most personal way possible. He would see it through, no matter how many dead ends he had to navigate. They ended the night on that quiet note. Dylan offered to stay over again, but Evelyn insisted she be fine. He left her with instructions to keep the doors locked, phone nearby. Around 10 o'clock, he drove back to his own apartment across town, mind buzzing with the next steps. He imagined Caleb and Russ out there, possibly ignorant to how close the police were to figuring out their identities, or maybe preparing for a confrontation. In any case, Dylan promised himself they wouldn't slip away. As he parked in front of his apartment building, he stared at the glow of the streetlights reflected in his windshield, fists clenching around the steering wheel. He allowed himself a single moment of anger at the cruelty his mother had faced. But beneath that anger was an unwavering resolve. They had names now. Tomorrow, they'd keep pushing, and if he had his way, justice would come knocking for Caleb Dunbar and Russell Hargrove sooner rather than later. He climbed the steps to his apartment, unlocked the door, and set his bag down with a weary sigh. The place felt empty compared to his mother's house. No warm lights in the windows, no comforting smell of home-cooked food. He flicked on a lamp, loosened his tie, and dropped onto the couch. Thoughts churned in his mind as he checked the message from Ranger again, reconfirming the names. Russ Hargrove, Caleb Dunbar. He mentally rehearsed a conversation with Malik. Maybe they could get a judge to sign a warrant if they found a last known address. The local police could do a simple pickup. This was how it worked, step by step. Before turning in for the night, he powered up his laptop and started typing out a more formal summary of the case so far, making sure each detail was clearly laid out. Tomorrow, He'd forward it to Malik. He'd also ask if they could possibly link these men to other counties. Maybe there was a pattern no one had pieced together yet. He wrote until his eyes blurred, fueled by nothing but the determination to see justice done. Finally, close to midnight, Dylan closed the laptop. He stared at the city lights outside his window, feeling exhaustion sink into his bones. Tomorrow, he thought, might bring them closer to an answer. His last conscious hope before drifting to sleep was that Evelyn's resolve would never be tested again. But deep down, he knew that when hatred found a foothold, it rarely surrendered easily. In the quiet darkness of his apartment, he vowed he would be the one to uproot it. Dylan began the next day by reviewing every detail from the local police files that Detective Ranger had forwarded overnight. He woke early, brewed an extra strong pot of coffee in his cramped apartment kitchen, and opened his laptop at the small dining table. Sunlight streamed in through the blinds, illuminating the screen as he read about the two men he believed had harassed his mother. Russell Hargrove and Caleb Dunbar, two names that now felt ominously familiar. Their minor arrest records went back several years and included charges like trespassing, public disturbances, and suspiciously vague, disorderly conduct incidents. Nothing big enough to send them away for long, but enough to paint a pattern of aggression and prejudice. He methodically typed notes, times, dates, locations of prior offenses. Russ's file showed him as a muscle-for-hire type, frequently hauling heavy equipment or doing odd construction gigs around the county. Caleb's record, on the other hand, was peppered with complaints about harassing neighbors, especially immigrants and families he perceived as outsiders. Dylan's stomach churned as he read the statements from frightened victims who had eventually stopped pursuing the cases, likely out of fear or a sense that nothing would come of it. His phone chimed with a text from Detective Ranger. Got a possible last known address for Caleb. Abandoned property on Birchwood Lane. Might be old info, but worth a look. Let's coordinate. Dylan sat back in his chair, eyebrows lifting with interest. It was the first concrete lead on Caleb's movements. He texted back that he'd meet Ranger at the station soon. Then he scrolled through his contacts until he found Malik Ortiz's number, calling the prosecutor's office line. Malik answered on the second ring, his voice brisk but welcoming. Ortiz speaking. Morning, it's Dylan Sanders, Dylan said, sipping his coffee. I have a new lead on Caleb Dunbar, an address. Detective Ranger's about to follow up. If she can find anything connecting him to a larger operation, or if we discover evidence of a hate-related motive, we'll want to secure the location. Potentially get a warrant if he's been using it for illegal activity. Malik hummed thoughtfully on the other end. Sounds promising. If they've used that spot as a base, we might find property damage, weapons, or evidence tying them to other incidents. I can move quickly on a search warrant if you see probable cause. Keep me posted. Will do. Dylan ended the call, feeling a surge of purpose. Every day that passed without Caleb and Russ in custody was another day they might harass someone else, or possibly circle back to threaten Evelyn again. He wouldn't let that happen. He took a quick shower, dressed in plain clothes suitable for on-site investigative work, then drove straight to the station. It was mid-morning by the time he arrived. Detective Ranger was waiting at her desk, phone pressed to her ear. She waved Dylan over, nodding curtly as she finished the call. Just coordinating with a patrol unit, she explained, hanging up. We've got an address that used to belong to a relative of Caleb's. The property's been vacant for a couple years, but a neighbor claims to have seen people coming in and out late at night. Could be squatters, or it could be Caleb and Russ. Dylan scanned the printouts Ranger handed him. A small single-story house at the end of Birchwood Lane, near a patch of woods, with a broken fence and boarded windows. The county records listed it as condemned. You said the neighbors saw movement at night. Any details on the occupants? Ranger shook her head. She just reported suspicious lights and what sounded like hammering or banging. Could be them doing repairs, could be something else entirely. That was about 3 weeks ago, which means it may be stale, or it could still be active if they're laying low. Dylan rubbed his chin, thinking, all right, let's head over. If there are signs of forced entry or illegal occupation, that might be enough for us to investigate further. I'll let Malik know if we find evidence of criminal activity that justifies a search warrant. But we should tread carefully. Caleb might be there, and if he's cornered, he could turn violent. Ranger agreed. They gathered a small team of uniformed officers and left in 2 squad cars. Dylan followed in his own sedan, phone buzzing periodically with updates from Malik. Evelyn hadn't messaged him yet. He assumed she was having a peaceful morning, maybe meeting a friend or running errands. He'd reminded her to stay vigilant, but he also wanted her to keep living her life. The last thing he wanted was for her to feel imprisoned by fear. The drive to Birchwood Lane took them out of the denser part of the city into a slightly run-down residential area. Houses were spaced farther apart, some with unkempt lawns, others sporting boarded windows and peeling paint. The local economy had seen better days, and many families had moved away. Eventually, they found the address near the end of a gravel road, flanked by tall weeds swaying in the breeze. Dylan parked behind the lead patrol car. Ranger and 2 uniformed officers stepped out, scanning the property. The house was small, paint flaking off its siding, roof sagging. A chain-link fence missing several panels surrounded an overgrown yard littered with debris. Old tires, rusted tools, crumpled soda cans. Dylan's gaze landed on a battered porch that sagged beneath a front door secured by multiple nails and a single, battered deadbolt. Ranger motioned for the officers to follow her lead. She gestured for Dylan to keep behind them, since they had official jurisdiction here. Approaching the rickety fence, Ranger announced, "Police. Anyone inside?" Her voice echoed through the still air. No answer. One officer circled around the side, peering through a cracked window. The other tested the front door, found it locked. Dylan kept his hand near his badge, the other near his concealed holster, in case someone bolted from the back. His pulse thrummed with a mixture of tension and anticipation. If Caleb or Russ were inside, this could be the break they needed. Ranger called out again. Silence. The officer who'd gone around back returned, shaking his head. No movement. Back doors barricaded with a bunch of junk. Dylan carefully peered through the closest window. Sunlight filtered into a front room strewn with debris. Appended chairs, a faded couch with stuffing poking out. It looked uninhabited, but that didn't mean someone hadn't squatted there recently. He pointed to a cluster of footprints in the dust near the window. Looks like relatively recent shoe prints, he remarked quietly. Might be from a day or 2 ago. Ranger nodded. We'll need a warrant to go inside unless we see an immediate reason to force entry, like hearing someone call for help or seeing a clear sign of a crime in progress. Right now, all we've got is a suspicion of trespassing. Dylan hesitated, scanning the property again. He spotted something near the back corner of the yard, a plywood plank leaning against the house, behind which he glimpsed a stack of spray paint cans. He told Ranger, and they moved over to investigate. Sure enough, behind that plank were 3 half-empty cans of paint. One was black, one red, one white. Rust had begun to form on the rims, but they appeared to have been used somewhat recently. Ranger jotted notes, her brow furrowing. Could be random junk. Or maybe they were painting hateful graffiti somewhere. We can bag them as potential evidence. If we can link them to vandalism in the area, that's probable cause to search inside. Dylan snapped a few photos with his phone, then carefully picked up the cans, avoiding smudging potential prints. A uniformed officer slipped on gloves and placed the cans in evidence bags. The sense of tension grew. Spray paint might be nothing, or it could be everything, depending on what forensics revealed. Ranger exhaled. All right, we'll log this. I'll call in to see if we can expedite a warrant based on possible vandalism or hate graffiti. Meanwhile, you and I can canvass the neighbors, see if anyone's noticed these guys. If they're squatting, somebody may have spotted them. They split up, each with a uniformed officer. Dylan took the houses on the right side of the gravel road, stopping first at a sagging ranch home with a scrawny dog barking from behind a chain-link gate. A weary-eyed older man answered the door, squinting at Dylan's badge. You the police? Federal agent, working with local PD, Dylan clarified politely, introducing himself. Sorry to bother you. We're investigating suspicious activity at the abandoned house next door. Have you seen anyone coming or going? The man grunted, scratching his stubbly chin. Yeah, I've seen a couple of fellas creeping around. Big guy, shaved head, and a smaller fella. They come by at odd hours, sometimes carrying boxes. Not sure what they're hauling in or out. I called the city once, told them squatters were messing around, but never heard back. Figured it wasn't my business. Dylan carefully jotted notes. When was the last time you saw them? 2 nights ago. Maybe midnight. Heard M cursing and banging around. One of my windows faces that house, so I peeked out. Saw him toss something in the backyard. Could have been furniture or trash, I dunno. Then they drove off. Any description of the vehicle? Dylan asked. The man shrugged. Old truck. Chevy, I think. Maroon or brown. Some rust on the side. Didn't catch the plates. Understood. Thank you for your help. If you recall anything else, or see them again, please call the number on this card. Dylan handed him his contact info. The man nodded and shut the door. Dylan walked back to the gravel road with the uniformed officer in tow, a flicker of triumph in his chest. This definitely sounded like Russ and Caleb. He relayed the neighbor's statement to Ranger via text, then knocked on a couple more doors. Most neighbors offered shrugs or stories of hearing unexplained noises, but no one had called the police except that one older man. One resident mentioned seeing 2 men matching Russ and Caleb's descriptions arguing in the yard a week ago, but couldn't offer more details. Finally, Dylan returned to the property, where Ranger stood with her phone to her ear. She ended the call, turning to him. We might have enough for a warrant. Malik's drafting it. If he can get a judge on the line, we might be able to search the place for evidence linking these guys to the string of hate incidents. Dylan folded his arms, gaze sweeping over the rundown house. I'm worried they won't come back here now that the neighborhood's buzzing with the presence of cops. They might have spooked. But if we find something inside, we'll have a better chance of charging them. Ranger nodded. Let's hope so. We'll post a squad car nearby to keep watch while we wait for the warrant. If Caleb or Russ show up, we'll catch them in the act. She paused, eyes drifting to the fence line. That said, you know these guys might decide to skip town if they get wind that the police are closing in. I'm aware, Dylan replied, jaw tight. I've already asked some contacts to flag any traffic stops or suspicious vehicle sightings. If they're driving an old maroon Chevy, that might help. Ranger pursed her lips, checking her phone. Malik's telling me the judge can sign the warrant by tomorrow morning. Until then, we can't legally break in unless we see a direct threat. She raised her voice slightly to include the uniformed officers. We'll coordinate an overnight watch. Let's rotate shifts. Dylan decided to stay on site for a while, texting Evelyn to let her know he was safe and updating her briefly on the situation. She replied with a simple, "Be careful," and his heart twisted at the concern he could sense between the words. As the day wore on, they established a perimeter, parked a patrol car discreetly down the street, and waited. By late afternoon, it became clear Caleb and Russ weren't making an appearance. With no movement, Ranger suggested Dylan head home, rest, and reconvene in the morning for the search. He reluctantly agreed, leaving 2 patrol officers on watch. He'd never been fond of stakeouts that stretched into the night, but it was necessary. Driving away, he felt a pang of frustration. They were so close to pinning these men down, yet it was still a waiting game. He decided to visit Evelyn before returning to his apartment, partly to reassure her that progress was being made, and partly to find comfort in her presence. He made the familiar trip across town, arriving at her house around dinner time. She greeted him with a warm hug, leading him inside to a savory smell of something roasting in the oven. He noticed she wore a simple, elegant blouse, as though determined to show she was not cowering at home in pajamas. I'm trying a new recipe, she said, gesturing at the kitchen. Creamy garlic chicken. I had too much time on my hands, so I thought, why not? He managed a tired chuckle. Sounds great. Taking a seat at her small dining table, he removed his jacket and placed his phone face down, wanting a momentary escape from the day's tensions. We got a lead on Caleb and Russ. Possibly they've been squatting in an abandoned house. We're waiting on a warrant. Evelyn busied herself ladling sauce into a bowl, her posture stiff with interest. So they haven't been arrested yet? Not yet, he admitted. We didn't find them inside, but we have enough to move forward. Tomorrow, we'll search for more evidence. The neighbor's statements suggest they've been there recently. With any luck, we'll get them soon. She glanced at the faint bruises still visible on her wrists. I hope so. I've tried to keep busy today, But every time the doorbell rings, I freeze. That's no way to live. Her voice trembled just enough for Dylan to notice. He rose and came around the table, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I'm sorry, Ma. We're on the right track, I promise. Whether it's tomorrow or the next day, they'll slip up and we'll be there. She nodded, forcing a smile. I know. You do what you have to do, and I'll do my best to be brave. She exhaled, then gestured for him to sit again. Now eat, before the sauce gets cold. They shared a quiet meal, the tension momentarily eased by the small comforts of home-cooked food. Dylan told her about Detective Ranger's diligence, about the neighborhood interviews, about how the bigger picture seemed to be forming. Evelyn listened thoughtfully, occasionally asking pointed questions. After dinner, they cleaned up together, and for a few minutes, Dylan forgot about the pressing weight of the case. As evening slid into night, he found himself checking his phone for updates. Nothing new from the stakeout. No sign of Caleb or Russ. He kissed Evelyn's forehead, telling her he had to head home and prepare for an early start tomorrow. She walked him to the door, lingering with one last piece of advice. Don't push yourself too hard, Dylan. You won't be any good to me or anyone else if you run yourself ragged. He promised he'd be careful, then drove to his apartment under an inky sky dotted with stars. The city lights glowed softly at the horizon, and he let himself hope that tomorrow would bring a breakthrough. His mind flicked back to the times he'd heard stories of his father's determination and sense of duty. Richard Sanders had been known for patiently gathering every piece of evidence until no doubt remained about a suspect's guilt. Dylan wanted to honor that legacy, for his father's memory, and for Evelyn's safety. When morning came, Dylan was already up before dawn, showered, and dressed. He grabbed a quick coffee on the go, arriving at the station precisely at 7. Ranger waved him over, brandishing a printed-out document with an air of triumph. Judge signed the warrant. We can proceed. You ready to check that house? His heart quickened. Absolutely. Let's go see what they were hiding. Together, they mustered a small team, 3 officers in uniform, 1 in plainclothes, plus Ranger and Dylan. They drove back to Birchwood Lane, greeted by the same overgrown lot and the battered porch. The 2 officers who had spent the night posted nearby reported no sightings of anyone coming or going. Ranger took a measured breath, warrant in hand, and signaled to the group. All right, folks, we have legal grounds to enter the premises and search for evidence, she announced, voice firm. Follow standard procedures. Check each room, be mindful of hazards, and keep an eye out for anything linking these suspects to further crimes. We good? They nodded. Dylan felt a small jolt of adrenaline as he approached the front door, now armed with the rightful authority to see what was inside. The uniformed officer used a crowbar to pry open the nailed door. It gave with a groan, the rusted hinges squeaking as stale air wafted out. The smell of mold and rot churned Dylan's stomach, but he pressed forward. They flipped on flashlights, stepping into what must have been the living room decades ago. Dust motes swirled in the beams of light. Broken furniture littered the floor. To the left was a corridor leading to a small kitchen area, shelves ripped from the walls. One officer let out a low whistle. This place is a wreck. Ranger and Dylan led the way, scanning for anything more recent than broken chairs and peeling wallpaper. They found footprints in the dust, multiple sets, going back and forth, as if someone had been pacing. Dylan crouched beside one, pressing his gloved finger against it. Definitely new. The treads looked fresh. They moved room to room, discovering evidence that the house had been used as a hideout. Empty energy drink cans, a stained mattress on the floor, a portable lantern. One corner of the room had a scatter of old newspapers, some with large holes cut from their pages. Ranger bagged them as evidence, speculating that maybe the suspects had cut out letters for anonymous threats. Dylan recognized the patterns from other hate groups he'd investigated, though it was too early to say for sure. At last, they reached a smaller back bedroom. The door had been kicked in at some point, and the room itself reeked of mildew. Dylan's flashlight revealed a row of spray paint stencils piled in one corner, shapes of letters that could be placed against a wall to spell out words. The officer behind him muttered, "Guess we found the source of the graffiti." Ranger knelt beside them, carefully lifting a stencil with gloved hands. It was shaped like a slur, the kind used to demean certain racial groups. A chill crept along Dylan's spine. That's definitely hate speech. If we match these stencils to graffiti around town, that's a direct link. The discovery fueled a grim determination in the team. They spent the next hour combing the house for more. They found empty beer bottles, scraps of paper with crude doodles, and a couple of baseball bats propped in the corner. One had nails hammered through the tip, which could easily turn it into a dangerous weapon. No sign of firearms, but the presence of the spiked bat suggested these men didn't shy away from violence. Finally, Dylan pushed open a closet door that stood ajar. Inside, he found a battered footlocker with a padlock. "Hey, we might need bolt cutters," he said. One of the officers hurried off to fetch them. When they returned, the lock snapped easily, revealing a jumble of items within. More spray cans, a half-burned notebook, and a cheap prepaid cell phone with a cracked screen. Ranger carefully lifted the phone, her eyes narrowing. "We'll get a tech to extract whatever's on here. Could have messages, photos, or contacts. Could be big." Dylan retrieved the notebook, gingerly flipping through charred pages. Some were unreadable, blackened by fire. Others revealed disjointed rants about keeping the neighborhood pure, along with references to neighbors who need to learn a lesson. He recognized references to specific addresses. Some victim statements he'd read matched these addresses. It was all spelled out in hateful language. His stomach tightened at the realization that the men had been systematically targeting people they deemed unwelcome. In the final pages, he found partial references to the Barn House, Markham Road, and Saturday midnight. No context, just a date and location scrawled in spidery handwriting. Dylan showed Ranger. Could be a meeting place? Something set for this Saturday? She nodded. "We'll check county records. Maybe the Barn House is a local bar or an old farm property. This might be the best lead to where Caleb and Russ will be next." One of the uniformed officers called them from the hallway. "We got more footprints heading to the backyard, fresh ones." Dylan and Ranger followed him out, stepping carefully over rotted floorboards. At the rear entrance, they saw where the door had been pried open from the inside, leading to the overgrown yard. The footprints vanished near a collapsed shed at the edge of the property. No sign of the men now, but it was clear they'd been there recently. By the time the search concluded, the team had collected enough evidence to bolster a strong case. Hateful stencils, a spiked bat, suspicious notes, and the phone that might hold key data. Dylan felt a grim satisfaction. They still hadn't caught Russ or Caleb, but they now had physical proof tying them to hate-motivated acts. Malik could use this to push for warrants on known associates, maybe track down that Barn House lead. Outside, they gathered on the weed-choked lawn, comparing notes. Ranger wiped sweat from her brow. "This is big. With this evidence, we can officially classify the assault on your mother as part of a larger pattern. Malik can charge them for hate crimes, not just simple assault. That means heavier penalties." Dylan stared at the dilapidated house, imagining the hateful planning that must have taken place inside these rooms. "Good. Let's make sure we lock them up before they hurt anyone else." He scrolled through his phone, already drafting a message to Malik about the notebook and the phone. His next step would be to identify Markham Road and the Barn House, but that would require a broader search, maybe property records, or a tip from someone in the local community. As they loaded their evidence into the squad cars, Dylan's mind drifted to Evelyn. Telling her about these findings would be bittersweet. She'd be relieved that the police now had proof of a bigger scheme, but it would also confirm that her assault wasn't random. He pictured her resolute face, the warmth in her eyes despite the fear she must have felt when Caleb and Russ cornered her. He promised himself that once these men were in custody, he'd do everything possible to reassure her that justice does indeed stand a chance against hate. They left an officer to secure the property while they headed back to the station, discussing the next moves. Ranger would process the evidence for fingerprints, Malik would expedite new warrants, and Dylan would try to find more about that Barn House location. The engine rumbled as he followed the patrol cars out, passing the suspicious neighbors' homes with curtains drawn. He realized that for the people around here, living in fear might be an everyday reality they'd grown used to. He wanted that to change. When they arrived at the station, Detective Ranger spread the evidence out in an evidence processing room. Dylan hung back, calling Evelyn. She answered quickly, voice tinged with apprehension. Dylan, is everything all right? Hey, Ma. I'm okay. Just wanted to update you, he said, stepping into a quiet corner. We searched the property, found a lot of hateful material, spray stencils, a bat with nails, all that ugliness. They weren't there, but it's enough to show they're part of a bigger pattern. We also found a possible clue about someplace called the Barn House on Markham Road. Evelyn's breath caught. A bat with nails, my goodness. These men are more dangerous than I thought. They are, he replied softly. But we have enough to show the courts this is serious. Malik will push for heavier charges. We'll find them, Mom. I promise. She took a moment before responding, voice steadier than he expected. I trust you. Just be careful, Dylan. I will, he said, and after a few more gentle words, they hung up. He glanced at the boxes of evidence, feeling both relief and a rising urgency. Caleb and Russ were still at large. The new leads might draw the net tighter, but until they were in handcuffs, no one was entirely safe. He walked back to where Ranger was photographing each item for documentation. What do you need from me? He asked. I can run the phone to a tech specialist or start digging for that Barnhouse lead. Ranger considered. Get that phone to tech. Meanwhile, I'll see if Markham Road has a property known as the Barnhouse. Could be an old farmland, a bar, or a nickname the locals use. If we identify a potential meeting spot for them, we might stage a sting. Dylan nodded, carefully placing the cracked phone in an evidence bag. He left the station, scanning the afternoon sky. The sense of progress felt tangible now, like the puzzle pieces were sliding into place. All they needed was one more break, one chance to corner Caleb and Russ before they struck again. As he drove away, he pictured the next steps in his mind. Analyzing phone data, cross-referencing properties on Markham Road, coordinating with Malik to see if they could intercept the suspects on Saturday night, if that date in the notebook was truly a meeting plan. Through it all, he felt the steady pulse of his resolve. He had begun this chase because they attacked his mother, but it was bigger than that now. Evelyn was one victim among others, and these men had turned their hate into a threat to the whole community. He intended to end it. Though the case was far from closed, Dylan could sense a shift in momentum. This time, the criminals had left behind a trail they couldn't easily erase. Hate thrived on darkness, secrecy, and fear, but sunlight and scrutiny were its downfall. He was determined to shine the brightest light possible on Caleb Dunbar and Russell Hargrove, and anyone who dared join them. Dylan spent the next 24 hours in a whirlwind of activity, determined to trace every clue the police had uncovered at the abandoned house. He arrived at the station early, hoping the tech team had successfully extracted data from the cracked phone they'd found in the footlocker. If there were messages or pictures linking Caleb and Russ to further crimes, or revealing where the Barnhouse was, this could be the breakthrough they needed. He'd barely set down his coffee mug in the evidence room when Detective Ranger rushed in, eyes bright with urgency. We might have something, she said, motioning for him to follow her down the corridor. They entered a small lab where a bespectacled technician sat at a computer, several cables snaking into the phone they'd recovered. On the monitor, lines of text scrolled by, a partial download of messages, contact logs, and timestamps. The technician looked up, pushing his glasses up his nose. It's a cheap burner phone, but we managed to pull the last few texts. Many are corrupted or erased, but there's a chain of messages to a number saved under Russ. They reference meeting at the old barn on Markham Road, same as the notebook. There's also a date stamped for this Saturday, time around midnight. One text says, "Bring the gear. Don't forget paint." Dylan leaned forward, scanning the screen. His pulse quickened as he read the words. They're definitely planning something, he muttered. Likely more vandalism or harassment, maybe worse. If they're referencing paint, they could be preparing a large-scale hate incident. There's also the possibility it's some sort of rally. Either way, we can't let them gather unsuspected. Ranger nodded sharply. Agreed. I've cross-referenced Markham Road. There's only one place known locally as the Barnhouse. It's an old farm property converted into a makeshift event space for small parties. But rumor has it it's sometimes used after hours by unsavory types. The official name is Overton Barn, though locals just call it the Barnhouse. Property taxes are still under the name of a family who no longer lives in the area. It's basically abandoned except for occasional rentals. The caretaker barely checks in once a month. Dylan frowned. So it's the perfect spot to meet, especially if they want privacy. Have we contacted the caretaker to see if there's any scheduled event this weekend? Ranger flipped through her notes. I left a message, but no response yet. If Caleb or Russ bribed or tricked him, or if he's clueless, either way it's an easy place to gather off the books. We've got enough evidence to suspect a criminal conspiracy. Malik says we can justify setting up surveillance on the property. The possibility of a sting operation sparked in Dylan's mind. They could wait at the barn, monitor everything from a hidden vantage point, and catch whoever arrived, especially if the suspects plan to engage in a hate-driven act. He turned to Ranger. We should coordinate with Malik and set that in motion. Do you think we can get a warrant to search the barn if we have probable cause of a planned crime? Ranger's phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. Speak of the devil, Malik's outside, wants to meet. She gestured for Dylan to follow. Together, they walked through the station's narrow corridors into the lobby, where Malik Ortiz stood in a charcoal suit, flipping through a file. His expression was serious, tempered by a faint nod of greeting as they approached. Morning, Malik said. I got your email. The references to gear and paint strongly suggest another hate incident, possibly targeting a community center or a private residence near that barn. Who knows? Given these texts, we can justify covert surveillance or a stakeout. But a full-on search warrant for the barn might be tricky unless we see them in the act. We do have the phone messages mentioning this meeting, but a judge might want more direct evidence of a planned crime before signing off on a full search. Dylan crossed his arms, frustration flickering in his chest. So we can watch, but not necessarily move in unless we catch them red-handed. That's about it, Malik said, looking apologetic. I can try to argue imminent threat, but without more specifics, like what exactly they plan to do or who they plan to target. It's a gray area. Still, if we see them carrying out illegal activity, or if we confirm they brought weapons, that's enough to intervene. Ranger slipped her phone into her pocket. We don't have much time. This Saturday is tomorrow night. We have less than 48 hours to plan. Let's set up a stakeout. If we catch them red-handed, we'll have all we need to lock them up. Dylan breathed a small sigh of relief. Progress was progress. Sounds good. Let's get the team. We'll place officers in unmarked cars around the barn. If we see Caleb or Russ show up, we move in. With luck, they'll lead us to any associates they might have. Malik hesitated. Be careful. If these guys suspect they're being watched, they could spook and run, or they could go violent. And if they have other followers, we could be outnumbered. We'll call for backup, Ranger said. We can't risk going in too light. We'll coordinate with the county sheriff if we need additional manpower. Hate groups sometimes bring more than a couple of guys. They exchanged further details, times, approach routes, call signs. Dylan volunteered to handle some of the gear. Binoculars, night vision cameras, anything to ensure they had eyes on every angle. The plan was to arrive a couple hours before midnight, set up in the woods behind the barn, and wait. Malik would be on standby nearby, ready to push for an emergency warrant if the situation escalated. They'd also keep patrol units within a mile radius in case the suspects tried to escape. After finalizing the plan, Malik hurried off to file paperwork, while Ranger stepped aside to coordinate with her captain. Dylan found a moment to slip outside the station, taking a breath of fresh air on the sidewalk. Cars rolled by in the morning light, and a few pedestrians hustled along, oblivious to the tension brewing. He checked his phone. There was a text from Evelyn. How's it going today? He texted back, making progress. Be safe. I'll call soon. Part of him wanted to tell her everything, that they might be facing not just two men but possibly a larger hateful assembly. But he didn't want her to worry any more than she already did. He promised himself he'd update her after the stakeout tomorrow night, hopefully with the news that Caleb and Russ had been arrested. All day, they prepared. Dylan arranged with the local sheriff's office for a few plainclothes deputies to help. Detective Ranger secured 2 unmarked SUVs. They studied satellite images of Overton Barn, noting the gravel driveway that cut through a narrow field of tall grass before curving around to a dilapidated structure. A cluster of pines and scraggly oak trees lined the back edge of the property, perfect cover for a hidden approach. They planned for 4 or 5 officers to hide among the trees, while others watched from vehicles parked discreetly on a nearby dirt road. The key was timing and coordination. The next evening arrived faster than Dylan expected. By sundown on Saturday, the stakeout team was in position. One unmarked SUV sat near a bend in the road, headlights off, vantage point angled so the barn's entrance was partially visible between swaying grass. Another unit was parked on a different approach route. Dylan, Ranger, and 2 deputies moved on foot through the trees, each wearing dark clothing and carrying binoculars, radios, and sidearms. They found a small rise that overlooked the barn from about 50 yards away. Light had nearly vanished, replaced by a deep blue twilight. The barn itself stood silent, moonlight glinting on broken windows. A single overhead floodlight near the front door flickered, casting an eerie glow across the warped wooden boards. Dylan crouched next to Ranger behind a fallen log, scanning the property through binoculars. His heart thudded in his ears. This was the moment. If Caleb, Russ, or any associates intended to meet, they'd show up soon.